Well, welcome everybody. I'm David Blight, the director of the Gilder Lehrman Center. Welcome to another of our GLC at Lunch talks. It's great to see so many people on today. We've been particularly of late reaching out to Yale graduate students at advanced stages with their dissertations to give talks about their work. And we're very pleased today to have Doyle Calhoun from the French department. I want to thank Daniel Vera, our media person, for setting all this up, and Michelle Zaks, our associate director, for organizing it. And Daniel, thanks for that choice of music again. You always come up with something different every week. I loved it. In fact, I've been moving to it here if I wasn't on screen. Anyway, let's get right to the case today. Doyle Calhoun is a fifth-year PhD student in French, doing a very historical topic, as you will soon see. Works on the histories of violence and resistance in the Francophone Caribbean and in African literatures. He's done work in both French and Wolof literature. He has written articles in numerous journals. I think I counted at least 5. And he had one article, Dead Narrators, Queer Terrorists, on suicide bombing and literature, which received a prize, the Ralph Cohen Prize of the journal New Literary History. Not only has he published all these articles, but one of them has already won a prize. He's had research fellowships from Phi Beta Kappa, from Chateaubriand, and from the Gilder Lehrman Center. He had one of our I believe our summer fellowships. And if I'm remembering correctly, Doyle, you got kind of caught or trapped. Was it in Martinique, I think? You can correct me. Where you couldn't go to the next island, or you couldn't get to Martinique for research because of unrest there last year, I believe. But you can tell us about that. Today, the talk is entitled Silenced Histories, Suicide and Slavery in the French Atlantic. Doyle, welcome, and it's over to you.
Thank you so much, David. And thank you to Michelle as well for the invitation to speak with everyone today, as well as Daniel, Vera, and Melissa McGrath for all of their organizing work. So I should start by saying that I'm not a historian. My project is a literary one. It's ultimately about how aesthetic forms such as literature and film provide different means of reckoning and other conduits for memory and histories of resistance when it comes to the widespread but largely occulted phenomenon of suicide as a response to French slavery and colonization. That being said, my project has involved a lot of historical research and involves a significant archival component. I make use of both traditional scriptural archives as well as an embodied archive of oral texts in Wolof related to slavery and colonization in Senegal, especially during the 19th century. My project also argues for a more capacious understanding of archive, one that takes seriously the capacity of aesthetic works to function as alternative archives in their own right. And so above all, I kind of attempt in my dissertation to show how writers and artists from the Caribbean and Africa bear witness to how people have vehemently and violently resisted their enslavement, colonization, and occupation from the very dawn of French imperial expansion. I do this with a combination of aesthetic works such as literature and film, but also archival materials and historical documents. I'm going to share my screen now just to make sure that everything works okay, and then we'll get into the presentation. I want to start with kind of a problem or a question about archive as it relates to slavery and specifically to suicide under slavery. I'm inspired in my approach by scholars such as Marisa J. Fuentes, a historian, but also sociologist Avery Gordon. With respect to suicidal resistance under colonization, I think that literature and film actually help us to reckon with what history has rendered ghostly. I want to start with two images, not from the French Atlantic world, but actually from the Anglo-American Atlantic. The first you'll recognize from my title slide. It's a depiction of an enslaved woman named Anna in 1815 in Washington, D.C. While being held in George Miller's tavern on F Street, Anna jumped from a window in the garret. Miraculously, she survived, although she broke both arms and badly injured her back. Anna's story was later taken up by the abolitionist writer Jesse Torrey in his portraiture of domestic slavery, where we find this engraving. The second image accompanied Thomas Day's and John Bicknell's The Dying Negro, one of the earliest pieces of verse propaganda condemning British slavery, dedicated to Jean-Jacques Rousseau and also quoted in the Abbé Grégoire's De la littérature des nègres. It had a circulation in French. The poem was inspired by a real-life incident, the suicide of an enslaved man reported in the Morning Chronicle in 1773. These two images are rare visual representations of suicide under slavery. The first showing an enslaved woman attempting to take her own life, the second an enslaved man contemplating doing the same. They shed light on a harrowing reality of chattel slavery in the Americas, namely that enslaved men, women, and sometimes children resisted capture and enslavement through suicide. The history of suicide in the British Atlantic has been well documented and is the subject of an excellent monograph by the historian Terry Snyder. There have also been important studies on suicide under slavery in Cuba, for instance. In fact, in Cuba in the 1840s, the rates of slave suicide on certain plantations became so high that an emergency colonial committee was convened to determine the contributing factors and to identify means of discouraging suicide among the enslaved population. But a study such as Snyder's and the kinds of historical studies that have been done on suicide in Cuba under slavery does not yet exist for the French Atlantic world. But we know from numerous historical sources and archival documents that suicide was a common enough occurrence under French slavery. Enslavers, missionaries, abolitionists, and colonial administrators all write about the suicides of enslaved men and women. But this history has tended to fall out of frame in mainstream accounts of French slavery and colonization, often relegated to footnotes or present only as anecdotal or passing references. The claim of my dissertation is that Caribbean and African writers and artists have registered what otherwise recedes from view. I'm going to start with a specific archival trace as a way of accessing this recessed history and surfacing some of the problems that suicide can be seen to pose for history and for memory. I'll then move on to discuss some of the particularities of suicide in the French Atlantic, and I'll conclude by touching on some of the broader theoretical questions that animate my research. My dissertation begins with the trial of a dead man. In the sparse prose of a handwritten procès-verbal, the grim details of the suicide of an enslaved man named Azer emerge. On the evening of April 27th in 1804 in Basse-Terre, Guadeloupe, Azer asked his enslaver, a printer and bookseller on the island, for money to buy some pain doux, a kind of butterless shortbread, to accompany a dinner of fried fish he was preparing. Cabre, the enslaver, gave him the money, and Azer returned home around 10 minutes later. Shortly after, at about 8 p.m., Azer took an empty pistol from his enslaver's bedroom, loaded it with ammunition, placed the barrel against his temple, and as the court document reads, quote, blew his brains out. The French is s'est brûlé la cervelle. The following day, Azer's act of self-destruction was tried publicly as a criminal offense. In French jurisprudence, the criminalization of suicide during the 18th and 19th centuries supposed mens rea. This meant that enslaved men and women who died by suicide were tried posthumously as criminals whose insurrectional acts threatened public order, and not as property, bien meuble, as they were inscribed in the text of the Code Noir. In a perverse paradox of French law, suicide was one of a few instances enslaved Africans appeared legally as persons, momentarily gaining the juridical force of autonomous subjects. The fact that a record of Azer's death exists at all is in itself rather remarkable, as this citation from the Abbé du Goujon makes clear the deaths of enslaved men, women, and children were ascribed so little importance that registers of the deaths of the enslaved captured little more than the sparest of details: name, approximate age, racial category, time and place of death, and the identity of the enslaver. Death records from Guadeloupe from the same period as Azer's suicide are so chillingly succinct that by comparison, the text of the Procès Verbal reads like a biographical document. This is one of the strange ironies of suicide that I explore in my project. The fact that suicide under slavery gives a sudden flash of visibility in the colonial archive, a fleeting glimpse of the lives and deaths of enslaved persons. As the citation from Dugoujean also suggests, the suicides of enslaved persons rarely were reported as such and frequently dissembled. Suicide was kept secret for a multitude of reasons, not least of which was financial gain. Under colonial insurance policies, enslavers could not be reimbursed for the loss of enslaved men and women who died by suicide. This stipulation was in direct contrast to indemnification policies applied to other causes of death, which could be the legitimate basis for insurance claims. One of the most famous examples of such policies at work in the British Atlantic is, of course, the case of the slave ship Zong. When enslaved Africans died by their own hands, they were ensuring that their enslavers were deprived both of the forced human labor that their bodies represented, as well as any monetary compensation. When the suicides of enslaved men and women were recorded in official documents, as with the case of Azer, colonial administrators were at pains to demonstrate both the infrequency of such acts and to show that they were not linked directly to the routinized violence of slavery. An example of this tendency from one of the highest levels of colonial oversight is the official report published by the Minister of the Navy and Colonies, Ange de MAKO. The report collected scant data on slave suicide in the aim of demonstrating the efficacy of a series of policies commonly referred to as the Loi MAKO, which were introduced in France's colonies in 1845, so shortly before the second abolition, to ameliorate the status and quality of life of the enslaved. Of the 19 suicides listed by MAKO, only one, resulting after a failed attempt at marronage, is connected, and even then indirectly so, to the actual conditions of enslavement. The rest are explained away in purely psychological terms that efface the routinized violence of French slavery and pathologizes suicidal ideation among enslaved populations. We see this too in the trial of Azer. So in the minutes to the trial, it's noted simply that his enslaver could not imagine a motive for Azer wanting to destroy himself, since he, quote, had always treated him well, and that the act seemed premeditated since Azer would have had to buy gunpowder beforehand. Appended to the minutes of Azer's trial is also a statement from a member of the judicial police suggesting that Azer's crime, his suicide, invited the revival of a form of public postmortem torture, which traditionally made a grisly spectacle of the bodies of enslaved men and women who died by suicide. This was known as the supplice de la clé, or the clé d'infamie. This form of postmortem torture involved desecrating the body of a suicide by stretching the corpse across a wooden frame that then was hitched to a horse and dragged through the streets. Popularized in Ancien Régime France and employed throughout the colonies as a suicide deterrent, the practice officially was outlawed in the metropole after the French Revolution, but it persisted in the context of French slavery, along with other forms of postmortem punishment for slave suicide, such as decapitation and dismemberment, and other public torture spectacles. Absent from the minutes of Azer's trial are key facts that would have been obvious to all parties involved and which allow us to grasp the significance of Azer's act of self-destruction more fully. Namely, Azer only recently had been re-enslaved. He lived as a free man for almost a decade until Napoleon's troops landed in Guadeloupe in 1802 to reestablish slavery. He witnessed and likely participated in the fierce anti-French resistance mounted against Napoleon's army by the formerly enslaved, a resistance movement that culminated in the suicides of Joseph Ignace, who shot himself in the head at Bainbridge, and the collective suicide of Louis Delgrès and 300 of his followers, who blew themselves up together at Matouba. We see contemporary monuments to this history of Delgrès and his followers and that collective suicide in both France and in Guadeloupe here. So here you see a symbolically empty plinth in the Pantheon, along with a commemorative plaque that commemorates Louis Delgrès's suicide, although in rather sort of elliptical terms. And then here you see two more recent monuments to Delgrès in Guadeloupe. The first which is just near Mutuba, and then the second in Pointe-à-Pitre. The case of Azer makes clear a pervasive historical reality, namely that Amerindians and sub-Saharan Africans resisted capture and enslavement at the hands of Europeans, and in the case of the trans-Saharan trade in human beings, North African slavers, through suicide. On land and at sea, across the Atlantic world, captive Africans and besieged Caribs leaped from great heights, tore open their throats, consumed dirt and ash, refused to eat, dashed their heads against rocks, self-asphyxiated by swallowing their tongues, choked, hanged, poisoned, burned, shot, and drowned themselves to avoid capture or to put an end to their enslavement. As Terry Snyder argues in her path-breaking study of suicide in British North America, The Power to Die, the history of slavery in the British Atlantic is a history of suicide. And so here I'll quote from Snyder: "From the beginning to the end of the slave trade, from the African interior to its littoral, spanning the Atlantic Passage to dispersal throughout the Americas, Africans responded to enslavement by destroying themselves." Suicide was a devastating and deeply complicated gesture of resistance and refusal carried out by enslaved women and occasionally children, both individually and collectively. It directly contradicted long-held European assumptions that suicide was a Western phenomenon and that Africans in general did not take their own lives. We see this latter claim repeated in many French 18th and early 19th century treatises on suicide. However, as French colonial presence in Africa increased throughout the late 19th century, some authors began to revisit the idea that non-European, especially African societies, were somehow immune to suicide, now faced with overwhelming evidence to the contrary. As a state of exception that Orlando Patterson famously theorized as social death, and an example of what Achille Mbembe has theorized as necropolitics, chattel slavery upended, indeed inverted, basic positivist assumptions about the sanctity of life, and thus also about the meaning of taking one's own life. In this context, suicide could hardly be considered a straightforward act of resistance, a defiant triumph of principled martyrdom, nor a simple capitulation to colonial power, a resignation to an abject state of victimage. The act instead, I think, lies at an irreducible intersection between technologies of the self and assemblages of the state, between ethics and politics. Throughout the slave trade and the emergent slave societies of the Caribbean basin during the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, the suicides of enslaved persons were widespread and visible enough that Europeans dissertated at length about how to prevent Africans from destroying themselves. Even after slavery was abolished in France's colonies in 1848, suicide among indentured laborers, the engagés, continued at rates high enough to provoke concern among plantation owners. For white abolitionists such as Victor Schellcher, suicide within slavery most clearly exposed the horrors of the slave system, slave trade and plantation system. It was one of the most compelling ethical and rhetorical arguments for abolition. For slavers, planters, and ship captains, however, suicide was anything but a moral quandary. It indexed a total failure of European control and represented a material loss, the destruction of saleable goods, that is, human cargo. Throughout the Atlantic slave trade, Europeans conducted pseudo-medical and sociological studies on slave suicide and introduced specific disciplinary sanctions and uniquely cruel punishments for suicidal captives. For instance, citing accounts from slave ship captains, the French abolitionist Benjamin Froissart describes how enslavers would hold burning coals to the lips of captives who refused to eat, or pour melted lead into the mouths of suicidal slaves to make an example of them. Enslavers manipulated slave religiosity to shape views of voluntary death by convincing the enslaved that the transmigration of souls was only possible if the suicidal body remained intact. They introduced forms of public postmortem punishment, as I mentioned, desecration, decapitation, dismemberment, as both spiritual and secular suicide deterrents. They developed new instruments to prevent self-destruction, such as the speculum oris, a device, you see illustrations of it here, that was used to force feed suicidal slaves. They also invented cross-shaped wooden bits designed to prevent captives from self-asphyxiating by swallowing their tongues. They installed special nets around the gunwales of slave ships to discourage Africans from leaping overboard. Such measures were intended to deter individuals from taking their own lives and to avoid the risk of a suicide contagion, even more so than a slave revolt, during which enslavers could justify the murder of the enslaved and then make a legitimate insurance claim. And we see this in sort of period documents. Collective suicide was to be avoided at all costs. This is one of the greatest ironies of imperial history, namely that Europeans first extensively innovated with methods of suicide prevention and experimented with new technologies of keeping alive in the context of chattel slavery in the Atlantic world, a necropolitical institution maintained through Black Death. As the case of Azer in 1804 suggests, suicide sometimes was premeditated and the result of careful planning. At least some enslaved men and women dressed entirely in white before taking their own lives, suggesting both a ritualistic preparation for acts of self-destruction and that voluntary death had certain vestimentary markers associated with it. Oops, sorry about that. My PowerPoint has just... So in one of these, you see in the image of Anna, for instance, she's wearing a white dress, and many sources cite that members of the enslaved community dressed in white before committing suicide. Just to get back. There we go. In some cases, suicide within French slavery was a spectacular and highly visible performance in which, to borrow Saidiya Hartman's phrasing, self-fashioning and self-destruction radically coincided. Schellcher, for instance, describes one especially striking scene of suicide that unfolded in Martinique in 1844. When an enslaved man, his bare body traversed with scars and fresh wounds, his ankles still bearing shackles, hanged himself directly below the windows of the governor's residence, thus providing a pointed and harrowing indictment of slavery and of the colonial administration shortly before abolition. In other cases, suicide involved seeking death through slow and less visible means, such as willful exposure to the elements or to disease and starvation. Sometimes death by suicide came after a psychotic break, resulting from the traumas and violence of slavery, at which point a slave was said to have lost their mind, or simply was prise de chagrin or désespoir. Consider, for instance, Schellcher's description of the suicide of an enslaved woman named Justine. In each case, the suicides of enslaved persons inspired fear, uncertainty, anger, and grief, but also occasionally resolve and approbation in the immediate enslaved and free communities, for the slave trade and plantation system, and among global abolitionist networks. The political, historical, and cultural significance of slave suicide in this way resounded far beyond the circumstances and context of any singular act of individual or collective self-killing. While it remains possible to trace and historicize European representations of and attitudes toward slave suicide across a variety of sources, and I make use of legal archives, insurance policies, scientific texts, coroner's reports, newspaper articles, abolitionist tracts, literary texts, discerning the meanings of voluntary death for members of the enslaved and colonized community is far more difficult. In the specific case of French slavery, this difficulty is part of a more profound silence, conditioning access to the voices of the enslaved and formerly enslaved. This is the spectral silence of the enslaved man Azer, whose own voice appears only under erasure, ventriloquized in the text of a legal trial, forgotten in the French colonial archives. As Christopher Miller has argued in The French Atlantic Triangle, in contrast to a rich Anglo-American scriptural tradition of firsthand accounts of slavery by the formerly enslaved, and here we might think of people like Phyllis Wheatley or Ottobah Cugoano or Equiano, there simply, and I'm quoting Miller here, there simply are no real slave narratives in French. And the enslaved, as Terry Snyder reminds us, typically did not leave suicide notes. Azer's silence is compounded by a further critical silence, namely a continued reticence on the part of scholars toward integrating acts of self-destruction into mainstream accounts of French slavery and colonization. What, following Michel Raftriot, we might characterize as a silence of resistance thrown against a superior silence. In fact, it's only very recently that forms of resistance to French slavery have received any sustained scholarly attention at all. Despite an immense literature on suicide in metropolitan France from the 18th century onwards, there's a near total silence with respect to the suicides of enslaved or colonized peoples, despite the pervasiveness of suicide as a response to French slavery and colonization, and this from the very dawn of imperial expansion. The forms of silencing surrounding the relation of suicide to colony and post-colony are pervasive. While suicide may seem like a timeless option discussed by essayists as varied as Cicero, Hume, and Sartre, its theorization can be historicized. It has even been described as a distinctly French obsession. By the end of the long 19th century, for instance, a period that coincided with France's most intense imperial expansion into North and West Africa, the nascent medical and sociological literature included so much information about French suicides that Durkheim could use suicide to measure social pathology. It's revealing in the sense that Durkheim's only reference in Le Suicide to suicide in France's colonies occurs in a footnote in his discussion of military suicides. Durkheim's concern is for French soldiers who cannot bear the traumas of colonizing war, not the thousands of Africans destroying themselves and their cities in deadly acts of resistance against French conquest. For all of these reasons, the phenomenon of suicide under slavery and under French Empire is not easily accommodated within existing interpretive frameworks. Literature and more broadly aesthetic works provide an opening and register what otherwise recedes from view. In the absence of archival sources or in the presence of overdetermined post-colonial scripts, aesthetic works keep alive occulted, silenced histories of suicidal resistance. With respect to suicide, they do what colonial imperial accounts cannot, or what as of yet such accounts have failed to do. In some cases, they make recessed histories of suicidal resistance available in writing and accessible to the collective historical consciousness for the first time. And so to conclude, I'll give you just a very brief example of what I mean by this. The image you see here is a monument to the history of the French slave trade and abolition in Nantes in the north of France, along the banks of the Loire River on the Quai de la Fosse. It was opened in 2012. If you walk the length of this memorial, you'll find glass bricks inserted into the paved esplanade. Each bears the name of a slave ship that departed Nantes for the coast of West Africa sometime during the 18th century. This monument is essentially an immense physical archive to the history of the French slave trade. One brick is of particular interest to my project, and it's sort of the story that I'll conclude with here. It bears the name of a French frigate, Le Soleil, captained by Louis Mosnier. On March 23rd, 1774, shortly after the ship had left the coast of Badagry in present-day Nigeria, a group of 14 enslaved women threw themselves overboard together at the same time. Nearly half of the women drowned or were devoured by the sharks swimming in the wake of the slave ship. The rest were fished out of the sea and returned to captivity in the hold. The captain, Louis Mosnier, made a short report of the event, which is now conserved in archives in Nantes. The intersection with the sort of literary dimension of my project becomes quite interesting here, because while researching in Nantes, the French Martinican writer Fabienne Canard came across Mosnier's report. Her novel Humus, published in 2006 and now available in English translation, interrogates and explodes this written trace into a polyphonic text, one that gives voice to the anonymous 14 women of Le Soleil. By splitting open a third-person account of suicidal resistance made in the 18th century by one French man, Canard produces instead a fugue for the middle passage, a contrapuntal text declaimed by the captive African women of Le Soleil, who all narrate in Canard's novel their fatal leap and flight from slavery in the first person. I think Canard's novel is an imaginative attempt to hear the voices of the drowned, voices that have not been archived. It writes into and against the colonial archive to allow spectral voices and silenced histories to surface in the present. it is, and this is sort of the argument that I make in my dissertation, an aesthetic response, as well as sort of a claim for the necessity of fiction, especially in the face of ghosted histories. So with that, I'll maybe stop sharing my screen and open it up for questions.
Well, thank you so much, Doyle. A harrowing topic, to say the least, but an extremely important one. I think in the human imagination of, well, the slave trade first, and then slavery in the Americas, this is always a question somewhere back in the recesses. How could people cope? Did they cope? Sometimes I think we tend to approach this with some kind of, we've all grown up in the age of psychology. The 18th century and the 19th century didn't have formal psychology. There's some wonderful points you've made here. I got 4 or 5 things I'd like to ask about, but we have some very interesting questions coming in. One is from a frequent viewer of all of our events, Adrienne Van Dyke, and she's asking what you know about the role of religion, African cosmology perhaps, versus Christianity, or part of Christianity eventually, that we might see this in the context thereof. Did any evidence about any of these cases? And I know that's part of your point, that there's a silence, not just of the archive, but of scholars about this. What do we know about the religion of Africans and how suicide might or might not have been an issue processed through that?
It's a great question, and it's one that I touch on in my research. One of the sort of main topics here is this question of the flying African. This is a sort of figure that we see across different oral traditions, and it's connected to the idea of transmigration, of sort of return to Africa through death, especially voluntary death. That's part of one of the cosmologies, I think, that's relevant here. And then, of course, each sort of linguistic, ethnic, racial group has, its culturally specific kinds of beliefs about death, about life after death. In the sort of Anglo-American case, Igbo's Landing is kind of a sort of famous site. It was the site of a group of Nigerian captives who waded into the water and committed sort of mass suicide. That's part of, often that is explained in terms of this figure of the flying African and this desire to return home through death. That's certainly part of the project. And then there's also this other dimension of religiosity, which is French Catholicism and also French missionary work. Many of the records and descriptions of suicide under slavery actually come from missionaries or come from kind of religious figures working in the colonies, often because they were also sort of abolitionist writers. And I think in those contexts, there's less of a tension between the fact that suicide would be considered taboo and sinful under Christianity, but actually that it's very clearly seen as a form of political resistance and sort of a kind of an extreme response to an absolutely unlivable condition. And so I think that also is, in my work, I'm kind of hesitant to sort of explain this phenomenon in terms of religious or spiritual beliefs, because I do think it also has to be considered as a kind of sort of a contestation of unlivable structural violence as well.
Yeah. Oh, well said. 2 questions from a good friend of ours, Lois McMillan, who teaches in Oregon. She's not only tuning in, she's tuning in with her high school class. So here and she tells us here, so you're speaking here to her class right now as well. She wants to know, first of all, was suicide, well, she's getting at the question here, the students are interested in the question here of resistance as one explanation of all of this, and wondering if it was more prevalent or if there's any way to know in the French Empire, in French slavery, or as opposed to British slavery. Is there any, I guess this becomes a Catholic Protestant sort of thing, or does it? Any differences in what people have uncovered about the British and the French?
It's hard for me to say with any kind of certainty about even the frequency, comparative frequency. I think that's a kind of statistical, historical research that I hope someone at some point will do. Terry Snyder has done some of that for British North America. That's not something that I feel equipped to do. But
tough one.
Sort of anecdotally, I can say that it was at least as common, I think, in the French Atlantic world, but then also in French West Africa. So a lot of my work has kind of focused on tracing this long history that is part of sort of the really sort of hews to the kind of sites of most intense French colonizing violence. I think with the French case, what is interesting is that you have certain episodes of suicidal resistance, such as the suicide of Louis Delgrès and his followers in Guadeloupe, that also become national narratives of resistance, emancipation, Black liberation. And there's a kind of narrativization of suicide that seems specific to the French case. And so I would say maybe that is one difference that can be.
Sure. Well, speaking of the French case, one of Lois's students wants to know, handle this however you want, should he or she now change their view of the Haitian Saint-Domingue revolution based on one of those episodes you mentioned? That great revolution, which is such an example of resistance, or how does one factor suicide into that kind of resistance in the Haitian Revolution?
Yeah, I think it complicates, and the kind of one of my general points is that suicide really complicates any sort of count of colonization and slavery. I think it really sort of, and it's also complicates a kind of historical narrative too. So yeah, I would say, and that, but there are also ways in which, so with Delgrès, for instance, Louis Delgrès, who was led the resistance in Guadeloupe and orchestrated this mass suicide, which was also an act of military aggression. So he and his followers lined a plantation with gunpowder, waited for Napoleon's troops to get in the ring, and then exploded themselves. So it was sort of, there was this double movement, right, between self-destruction and destruction of the other. It was one of the earliest examples of a suicide bomb, not in the way we often think about it today.
Right. Has that been written about widely, that episode?
Laurent Dubois has written about it. And
in Laurent's
yes,
one of his books on the Haitian Revolution.
He writes about it, but
interesting.
And I have a chapter focused on it in my dissertation.
Oh, great. Yeah. There's a question here. Are you intending, I guess the question is, are you intending, or do you ever have thoughts, since you are in literature, of trying to write fiction about this? That is, I guess this question comes from this idea that we need art to gain access to this kind of a story. I have so often said in my own teaching with students, the slave trade and many other aspects of slavery. This is why we need the poets. This is why we need artists to give us access to this in the absence of other kinds of, I don't know. Is there any inkling in you to try to convert any of this to fiction?
I don't think I am necessarily interested in writing.
Okay.
I think, but I would say, your point about sort of the necessity of art and aesthetic forms
Yeah.
is crucial, and I think it becomes a really important supplement in the French case because we have so few firsthand accounts of slavery by members of the enslaved or formerly enslaved. And then I would also say that criticism, literary criticism, also I think has a role to play, not as fiction, but as a kind of mediation for between the two.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I've so often used, for example, Robert Hayden's poem called Middle Passage about the slave trade. It's such an incredible poem. It's almost an epic poem. It's long.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I use it just because it really does imagine our way into the holds of slave ships and into that experience. One can say the same of something like the Holocaust in the 20th century. Without art, how do we gain access to it? And speaking of art, could you talk a little more about all those monuments you showed? The one in Nantes about the slave trade, but the ones was it Guadeloupe? Those were amazing. Those images. Yeah. And I think the ones in Guadeloupe went up in what, 2000 or 2001? They're pretty recent.
2001, 2002. Yeah, they're part of this sort of memorial turn at the sort of 2000s, and then again, there's another sort of memorial turn around 2009, 2010, in France especially. The memorial in Nantes is much more recent, so it was opened in 2012, but conceived in that moment, 2010. And they're all, I think that both the monument in Guadeloupe has sort of Delgrèze's head in the center of a kind of stone labyrinth. And that is really one of the sort of main monuments to the history of Delgrèze. And it is also interesting because it's figural, right? So it represents Delgrèze, and then even within the sort of geometric design, whereas the reference to Delgrèze in the Pantheon, which is sort of, the paradigm of French nationalism, is so elliptical, and it kind of removes suicide from the text of history, really. It says, the plaque says he was mort sans capituler, so he sort of died without surrender. There's no sort of actual acknowledgement of the fact that this was an act of self-destruction. So there's a tension, I think, between the kinds of commemorative forms.
Some are direct, some are indirect.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the monument in Nantes is really powerful, I think, too, because it occupies space that slave ships, the space along the Quai de la Fosse where slave ships once docked in the 18th century. But what I think sort of none of those monuments are capable of doing is something that a text like Hume's Fabien Canard's novel actually does, which is it sort of provides a way to get at even sort of less visible history. So the history of these enslaved women, unnamed enslaved women, who are recorded just within a line or two in a ship's log. But she's able to expand that into a novel. And so that's sort of also, I think, where scholars like Marisa Fuentes and Cydia Hartman really come in terms of, how do we narrate these sort of fleeting glimpses of enslaved subjects, but especially enslaved women within archives that sort of disproportionately silence them.
We've got a couple of questions here about any evidence of infanticide by women, particularly of their children, drawing off, of course, at least now, the Toni Morrison's Beloved.
Yeah, absolutely. And
I think, well, one question is, have you found any examples of infanticide? And then I think Michelle wants to jump in and weigh in on that question as well, but go ahead.
There are infanticide and suicide go hand in hand often. They're these forms of biopolitical resistance, and they're also, infanticide is, I think, more documented, at least in the French case, and has been written about a bit more. But no, they're certainly part of sort of this sort of field.
Is that because they get more legal coverage since it's an act done?
I think that, and then I think there's also a kind of ideological sort of social commentary about. I mean, also you have the partus sequitur ventrem, so the whatever, you know, there was also a way in which the sort of status of of enslavement was transmitted through the mother, right?
Right.
Part of it. There's a legal reason for that too.
Michelle, you wanted to come in on this. Go ahead.
Actually, no, that was just a mistake on my part, but I did have another question.
Well,
and first of all, thank you, Doyle, so much for the work and for the kind of solemnity you bring to this difficult topic. But I was so interested to hear you say, I think you were saying that there's, in French historiography, there's a silence about suicide during slavery and the slave trade, but also in general, a silence about resistance. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts about why that is, and also if there's, do you think, any relationship to the Haitian Revolution as this, as Trio says, this unthinkable event? So let's just avoid the whole topic of resistance.
No, I mean, and I mentioned Trio too, because he is one of the scholars who has really sort of pinpointed this reticence on the part of French intellectuals and the French Academy in general to sort of look at this history. I think this is also one of the contrasts between Anglophone scholarship and Francophone scholarship on slavery, abolition, and resistance, is that you have much more robust sort of research and scholarship on resistance to slavery in the Anglophone kind of sphere, whereas really it's only within the past decade that resistance studies has really sort of started to gain any kind of traction in France. And it's sort of also, there are a few scholars, Elsa Doyle, for instance, Françoise Vergès. These are scholars who have sort of also kind of criticized that kind of reticence on the part of French historiography. The sort of irony, though, and the contrast is that there is a lot of writing on suicide more generally as a metropolitan phenomenon and as a sort of psychological phenomenon, one that really evacuates the political stakes, I think. So Durkheim is kind of the obvious example, but even more recently, there was a monograph published just last year called Suicide Voices, which is about the suicide of laborers in France. And so this is a response to the suicide epidemic that was in France a few years ago. And it's kind of, there's been substantial work on that context, but virtually nothing on suicide under colonization, which sort of, just in terms of the sheer scope of it, was much more significant.
I'm struck, and I'm reminded, this is not precisely what you're writing about, but there's a now important essay, kind of famous within slave trade scholar circles, by David Richardson, British historian of the slave trade. It was, probably 15 years ago. But he did this highly statistical study of rebellions aboard slave ships.
Yeah.
And in British slave trade, I forget the dates now, but over a long period of time, they just ran all the numbers of any evidence of an aboard ship rebellion. And out of that came, and of course, a lot of those ended in the deaths of many of the rebels on those ships. But they came up with a statistic that showed that about 1 of every 10 slave ships had some kind of rebellion aboard ship that got recorded by captains, by companies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And from that, they extrapolated, as good economic historians will, how much this forced the British slave trade, particularly in the 18th century when they got so big into it, to increase all of the restraints, the nettings, the shackles, God knows, all that technology, really, of restraint aboard, and how it cost the slaving companies so much more money over time. And they even, if I'm remembering that essay correctly, and I'm probably not, but they even concluded that these aboard ship rebellions cost the slave traders some X amount of money over the years, and may have, well, they can't prove this, but may have ushered in the anti-slave trade movement even earlier, because all this news of these, well, like the Zong,
Right.
and the impact that had back in Britain. It's amazing. So
Absolutely.
this isn't necessarily the history of suicide here, but slave ship rebellions were in effect suicidal.
Right, and they were often linked. So in some of the sort of accounts by French ship captains, you see this. The fear about suicide is actually a fear about revolt. And so that's also where, you know, I mean, I didn't have time to sort of present some of this, but the technologies of suicide prevention within the slave trade alone, you know, I think warrants kind of a careful study.
Well, you're getting first of all, you're getting a bunch of accolades here in the Q&A, but there's another question here. Speaking of literary treatments, he says, of the slave experience, have there been any literary or dramatic expositions of this story or of slave infanticide patterned on the famous Greek tragedy of Medea? Well, I mean, actually, Toni Morrison's story has often been compared to Medea.
Right.
Go ahead.
I can't think of sort of a very specific, there is actually, and this is outside of the history of slavery, but within French colonization, there's an Algerian writer, Zahir Rahmani, who has written an Antigone trilogy, which is about French Algerian history. And I do know there's also another Algerian writer who has written a sort of suicidal novel that's loosely based on Corneille's Sophonies, but which is another one of his tragedies.
Well, again, the thank yous are coming in over Q&A. I guess I mean, we're almost out of time here, but let me just ask you another kind of big, broad question here. How'd you land on this topic? Did you land on this topic because you wanted to study this from the beginning? Did you land on this topic because you were reading French colonial literature? How did you end up here with slavery, slave trade, and suicide? I'm just curious what's your scholarly path to this subject?
So the kind of role that French slavery has played in my project was actually not sort of something that I had anticipated. This project started, I was doing research in Senegal related to a filmmaker, Ousmane Sembène, one of his landmark films, La Noire de Black Girl, which is about a suicide. And it's based on a real life event. And I was able to find the police file and sort of uncover this history that was related to a suicide in the 1950s. But the way that suicide is framed sort of visually cites a kind of genealogy of suicide as a response to enslavement. And Michelle and I were talking about this briefly actually before the talk, but there's a number of local histories of suicidal resistance in Senegal as a response to colonization and slavery. So it was doing that research that this started to become a larger project. And then I think for me, just as a scholar, my interest in West African literature also requires engagement with the Atlantic worlds and the Caribbean basin, just as it also requires sort of engagement with the trans-Saharan trajectories. So I think it was sort of a natural progression. In order to sort of think about this project historically, I had to go back to the 18th century and to the Caribbean.
You know, and one last thought here, and I'd love to hear your reaction. It's certainly been my impression that the world has struggled ever since whenever you want to date the end of the slave trade in the British Empire, the French Empire, and the Spanish Empire, and so on and so forth. The world has struggled to figure out how to mourn this.
Yeah.
Memorialize, yes, but even to mourn this phenomenon. 400 years of a slave trade, 400 years of slavery and the slaving business in the Americas and so on. And there's no simple answer to any of this, of course. But what you're doing, and by looking particularly at the arts, everything from fiction to drama to memorialization to film, et cetera, is the process by which all cultures mourn one way or another. I mean, do you think that's part of, and mourning in this case, the story of self-destruction?
Yes.
Are you aware of that? I mean, I don't know. Not that you are, not that your job is to teach us how to mourn the slave trade, but it does seem to me that some part of this, even for scholars, even for the economic scholars, it is helping us mourn something by knowing about it.
Yeah, and I think I think the thing that I try to shed light on is the fact that these works of art, that they function in place of historical documents and archival documents that either don't exist or reproduce the kinds of structures that lead enslaved men and women to disappear from view. So it is a form of recuperative work, but it's also a form of mourning and grief work, I think, and that's certainly part of this project. I mean, that is also where there's an element of hope in such a harrowing topic and such a grueling topic, frankly. That's sort of where there is a kind of glimmer of something, of a future in all of this, I think.
Well, beautifully said, Doyle. And as others in the Q&A have said, thanks so much for this talk, for your research, for your work. And what actually happened when you were heading to Guadeloupe, weren't you? And you couldn't.
I did get to Guadeloupe, but barely. I was in Martinique for a while, and then Guadeloupe shut down because of protests related to COVID, and then Martinique shut down. So it was a whole ordeal.
Well, there are many ways to be sidelined by COVID, and
yes,
and you were. Oh my goodness! Well, are you still going to go back now, or
I'm going to try, I think. Fingers crossed.
Okay. Well, again, thanks so much. This has been a great talk. We had a great audience, and they're still with us. Everybody's still with us. They don't want you to stop. I feel like I need to ask another question here, but we're going to run out of time.
Thank you, David.
Thanks so much, and see you soon around campus, I hope.
Thanks
everybody for coming today. And Michelle has put in the chat a whole variety of announcements. Michelle, you want to say anything about that?
I think the announcements speak for themselves.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming. Have a good